I'm Chris Wytock. I'm professor of law and vice dean at the UC Irvine School of Law, and it's my honor today to introduce today's Mohannad and Rana Mallis Lecture in Islamic Studies. The Mallis Lecture facilitates engagement at UCI and in the broader community on issues related to Islamic law, as well as topics where public discourse can be informed from an Islamic legal perspective. We are honored that today's Mallis Lecture will be delivered by Professor Zahra Takhshid, welcome, who's an assistant professor of law at the University of Denver Sturm College of Law. Professor Takhshid is an expert on both Islamic law and emerging technologies, and her topic today reflects both of these areas of expertise, the legal and ethical guidelines for artificial intelligence and Islamic perspective. Welcome, Professor Takhshid. Thank you so much for joining us today. I would also like to express my deepest gratitude on behalf of UCI and the UCI School of Law to Mohannad Mallis, who so generously endowed the Mohannad and Rana Mallis Chair in Islamic Legal Studies. It's his support that makes this lecture series possible. Mohannad, thank you for joining us today. We thank you for your support of UCI Law through this gift and through your continued participation as a member of our community. I'd now like to introduce my wonderful colleague, Professor Dana Lee, who is Assistant Professor of Law and the Mohannad and Rana Mallis Scholar in Islamic Legal Studies at UCI Law. Professor Lee is an interdisciplinary scholar whose research examines the intersections of history, jurisprudence, law, and ethics with a particular focus on the Islamic legal tradition. Professor Lee's courses include Introduction to Islamic Law, as well as Comparative Law and Property Law. Dana, I'm honored and happy to be your colleague, and I'll now turn it over to you.
Thank you so much to Vice Dean Chris Wytock for that introduction and for his support of this event. I'd like to also thank the Interim Dean Bryant Garth for his support. And also, I'd like to express thanks to the people who worked so hard to make this event possible, including Jillian Henry, Josh Larson, Rebecca Bergerson, and Marianne Soden. I'm very grateful for their assistance with planning this event. Finally, I would like to express my very deep gratitude to Mohannad and Rana Mallis, whose support has not only made this event possible, but has also really been instrumental in creating this intellectual space for Islamic legal studies here at UCI Law. Before I introduce the speaker, I would just like to note that following the talk, we'll be reserving time for Q&A. So if you are joining this event remotely, please go ahead and type your question into the Q&A function through the Zoom webinar. And we have someone in the room who will be able to read your question out for us here in person. So it is my pleasure today to introduce Zahra Takhshid, who is Assistant Professor of Law at the University of Denver Sturm College of Law. Prior to joining Sturm College of Law in 2021, Professor Takhshid was the Lewis Fellow for Law Teaching and Lecturer on Law at Harvard Law School. She teaches and writes on a wide variety of subjects, including torts, contracts, privacy, social media, and technology in the law. Another strand of her scholarship really focuses on Islamic law and comparative law. Professor Takhshid is a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, and she's also an affiliate with the program in Islamic law at Harvard Law School. She was selected as the 2021 Quantum Fellow at the Center for Quantum Networks of University of Arizona in partnership with Yale Law School's Information Society Project. So please give me a join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Zahra Takhshid.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here at UC Irvine. I want to thank my colleague, Dana, and also the University of Irvine Law School for hosting me, and especially Mohannad and Rana's generous donorship to the law school in promoting Islamic law and scholarship and allowing these kind of conversations to take place. This is also my first maskless event, so I'm really excited about that, and hopefully not the soon the last one with the new COVID variant, but I'm also grateful to everyone who's joining online and look forward to your questions. I was expecting students more than colleagues, so I apologize if some of this material looks a little bit like introduction to you, but hopefully still interesting nonetheless. So I'm going to be talking about artificial intelligence and the guidelines that have been promoted throughout this past few years by various institutions and scholars that are doing research on this. To begin, I'll do an introduction about AI in general and why we need guidelines. Then I'll introduce some of these guidelines that are commonly talked about between the legal tech scholars, and then I'll try to make an example that would showcase how maybe some of the ways that Islamic literature and ethics and laws differ in some respects, and how they can either add or modify some of these guidelines as they relate to this different tradition. And lastly, I'll hope to intrigue some questions and thoughts by thinking about the issue in a broader sense. So to begin with, even though we talk about AI, I've noticed that sometimes my students don't even know what we're talking about. So I thought it would be good to start by introduction of what do we mean by artificial intelligence. All of it goes back to algorithms that have recently become really widespread with different languages that you see engineers are using, like Python, C++, which is the old one. But overall, these algorithms are basically a way of giving an input to the machine and then expecting an output. And sometimes an easy way of demonstrating how algorithms work, they say, you know, the same way that you're making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, you do the spread of peanut butter first and then the jelly, and then you have it, a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So it's basically instructions. Algorithms are also instructions. As they are getting, a note on the name of algorithm that may really relate to our talk is that where's this coming from? It's actually goes back to this Persian scholar and mathematician, Al-Khwarazmi, who worked heavily on numerical work on he was also an astronomer and did a lot of work basically, and because of the kh pronunciation that is difficult for the Western audience, the kh was in this translation lost and turned into a g that resulted in algorithm being coined from algebra to what we now call, again, algorithms. So I thought this would be also a fun fact. Same like my last name, the Takhshid. I usually go by Takhshid, even though it's a kh. So with that, as algorithms got more and more sophisticated and engineers became really in tune with using them and creating new ways of making them work, we produced this area that is known as artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is also hard to define, and that's why even with the current guidelines that we have, sometimes they refuse to define AI because of the different ways and different things that it does. But one way of trying to make sense of it is it's a way of pattern finding. This is a definition that the book Noise that was written by Daniel Kahneman and Cass Sunstein talk about it. We can also say that it's just an advanced way of coming up with problem solving, that it mimics the intelligence of a human because it's now sometimes autonomously done by the machine. And it, again, in this evolvement, it's becoming more and more complicated. There are various ways that now AI is being used, and this new field of machine learning also has become very sophisticated with different ways that machine learning now works. These are some of the ways that today we talk about machine learning. The deep learning is now the most advanced neural networks also in terms of learning that is really trying to mimic human intelligence and brain cells that are allowing machines to operate on their own. So one example, I won't play this video, but this is a machine that is trying to show how reinforcement learning works, and it's a machine that learns how to flip a pancake. So by try and error and doing it multiple times, a lot of times, the video goes through it, it finally learns how to flip the pancake without the pancake falling out of the pan. So this is one way, a really simplified way of machine learning. So from all of that, we are moving to these very quickly to different fields that AI is now being used, and one that's become really trendy, and you might have heard, is of course VR, sorry, and what there are coined sometimes as XR, extended reality technology, that includes virtual reality, augmented reality, and mixed reality. So with virtual reality, you are completely in that area where you are disconnected from the outside world that surrounds you. With augmented reality, it's typically you are using something to allow you to project a digital creation that you can see, let's say, through your phone. You may have experienced that nowadays. Apple allows sometimes, if you want to try out the phone, it had this option of looking through your camera phone and seeing your new iPhone on the table, even though it doesn't exist. Or, for example, the common game Pokemon that places these digital creatures, and users follow them to try to find them. So this is an example of augmented reality. And while they are different from artificial intelligence, they are becoming really popular by in combination with AI and the use of machine learning. And these are just pictures of some of the ways that you can connect to this world with virtual reality headsets that nowadays are becoming really cheap compared to what they used to cost years ago, that were really for only a specific group of people, whereas nowadays it's even cheaper than an iPhone to buy a VR headset. And the Ray-Ban picture, for those who may not have heard of it, it's also a product of Meta, formerly known as Facebook, that is promoting this way of using technology to say that we are moving towards a world where soon we won't be using our phones anymore, because phones are disruptive. When you want to take a picture, you have to take it out of your pocket, look through it, or if you are in this conversation with someone, just pulling out your phone is disruptive. So we should think about different ways of taking pictures or connecting to the augmented world. And one way is through these glasses that allow you to record and take pictures, even though they are still very simple in terms of technology. But this is the future, and it holds promises and also challenges. So this is an image of how they hope the VR world will be used. For example, we might imagine all of us being in a virtual reality meeting room, talking to each other on the image on the left. And this is a social platform called Horizon World that is also designed by Facebook, that allows you to connect once you have VR set. And these are the positive aspects. I thought I'd share some of the images. For example, you may have heard in the news there was a wedding that took place in the VR on the left. And recently, University of Ottawa in Canada did a moot court in a VR setting, saying that we're moving towards the world where our lawyers should understand these digital environments, because you may expect that maybe not within the next 5 years, but maybe 10 years, especially after COVID and the need for these digital environments, we will move to the world where we have no longer Zoom cats as lawyers, but actually a VR setting for a Zoom room. And this is the example of Pokemon that I talked about. And why I'm showing these, because Now, these fun games can also bring legal challenges. So with the Pokemon game, there was a lawsuit that initiated a call for trespass, that users were trespassing private properties to gain access to these digital creations, and they sued the company saying that you are at fault you should be responsible for allowing this to happen. Why have you designed it this way? And the talk of whether you could hold the platform responsible based on the tort of trespass or not became really hot, even though, let's say, unfortunately, the lawsuit ended up in settlement. So we don't have a legal opinion on what the result is, but you can guess that when a company moves towards settlement, it's an indication that they were scared that they might be held responsible for the trespass that was happening. Apparently, they also knew about previous examples of this happening and hadn't done anything. So in the settlement, they said that we're going to allow this reporting system on the game to let those who are being, their property is being trespassed to report that. Another reason why this may be a challenge is also this new VR world allows for a new form of data collection. We hear a lot of talk about data privacy and what that means to us, and we're still haven't figured out, at least in the US, a federal approach to data privacy, albeit maybe very soon with the talks that are going on right now. But still, as we're figuring out how we want to talk about a Section 230C or privacy and data, we are now challenging, we're seeing the new challenge of nonverbal data and to the extensive amount that these VR companies that are using, that are benefiting from users may in the future use those nonverbal data that are being collected now. So all of that creates the question of what are we going to do with this? So obviously, on the one hand, you don't want to stall companies from being creative. You want to promote creation and you want to promote these kind of technologies. But on the other hand, they're moving so fast that it's almost seems to be useless to try to come up with stringent rules and laws that may either hinge these productions or change so quickly that they may become moot or inapplicable in just a matter of a year or two. So with that, some scholars try to come up with guidelines. So let's have guidelines that are not as a guideline is mandatory, but maybe helpful in thinking about who to hold responsible, what kind of technology do we want to have, what kind of things should our engineers be thinking about when they're designing these products? Should there be also an awareness on their part, or is it all about looking after the accident and trying to place the fault on someone? So while some countries try to come up with their own principles, just recently UNESCO passed an ethical recommendation on the use of artificial intelligence. It incorporated values in it that talk about respect, promotion of human dignity, human rights, environmental flourishing, ensuring diversity, and obviously peace. And they also provided some guidelines like the no harm principle, safety, fairness, sustainability, guidelines on privacy and data protection, human oversight, transparency, responsibility, awareness of these technologies, and of course, government collaboration. So I'll go through some of these in the next few slides to open them up and for you to think about them. There's a great study that was done by Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University that this was before the UNESCO principles were passed. They did a map of these ethical and right-based approaches throughout the world and came up with the common themes in some of these principles that already exist. For example, Beijing had its own principle, Dubai had one, and they tried to see what is most common in between all of these guidelines that we now have. So I'll go through some of them for you. So privacy is triggered when we're using AI. Why? Because a lot of AI technologies allow for surveillance. They're involved in healthcare decision-making, advertisement, and so privacy is implicated throughout the system when we're using this. Some of the ways in thinking about how we want to approach the challenge of privacy when using AI is what do we mean by consent? How do we want that to work? What about control over our data? What about the ability to restrict our transfer of data to one company from the other one, because now data is being monetized, as you know, and has value. There's also some of the rights that these guidelines talk about are right to erasure, right to rectification, privacy by design. That used to be very popular, that you place the burden on the company to design a product from the beginning that incorporates privacy in its technology. There is the talk of accountability, that when we're using AI, we should also be thinking about its environmental impact, thinking about maybe having a monitoring body that would watch out for the consequences of these AI use. What about thinking about having a right to appeal? So for example, if a decision has been made by an AI, let's say your loan has been denied by the bank because the AI system that the bank is using has determined that you shouldn't be qualified. Should you have the right to appeal? Remedy if you have been hurt as a result of that false or a negative decision that the AI made for you, and who to place liability. We want to have to be thinking creatively about whether these companies should be held responsible, or do we want to create a new different legal entity like corporations that are able to go bankrupt? Do we want AI to also have that legal entity, which hasn't been so popular? Thinking about safety and security as another AI principle, that we want to have systems that do what they're supposed to do. This is important because you may also know that AI is extensively used in war zone areas by drones and automated weapons. So they are also dangerous. Security, especially when we're talking about cyber attacks, is a concern that we want to make sure we offer safety. Transparency and explainability refers again to another important AI principle that is also debatable for some people who say that it's impossible to ever explain the decision of AI. So if we want to promote such a value, we may be hinging the development of these technologies. But again, with transparency, do we want to use only machines and technologies that we can have that kind of transparency of decision making or explainability? Or should we allow for them to do what they're doing, even though there's a black box that you can't really point out to how the algorithm is giving you the output? While it gets the input, how does it reach to the output or the decision that it's coming out with based on the data that it has? So some people would say if we can't explain it, we shouldn't be using that technology to begin with. Maybe it's not yet ready. Right to information is another value that is talked about, that it might include information about your personal data and how it's being used in, when an AI is making that decision for you. This is again going back to the roots of transparency. Should we make it mandatory for you to know when you are interacting with an AI machine, or is that not something that we care about? And it does have legal implications, as people may rely on those machines thinking that they're interacting with human, whereas it might be a fraud to begin with. So one personal example maybe I would give is, so if you call Apple support, last time I checked was a month ago, so don't call me if it has changed, but Apple support, when you call them, a machine is picking up the call, and it actually tells you that I am a machine that I'm talking to. But the funny thing is when you say, okay, so what is it that you need? You say, I want to talk to customer support. So it echoes a sound of typing, as if the machine is now typing your request. So it becomes really confusing. If you are telling me that you're a machine, why are you replicating the sound of typing that would indicate to someone who may not have had, for example, heard the first part of your the machine's talk, that now you're typing, imitating a human behavior that may fool people in thinking that they are interacting with a real person. And again, this example may not seem dangerous, but when you have phone calls that come to people who may not be who may not have the knowledge of these issues, they may fall into trap of losing money and a lot of other examples that you may also hear in the news. Fairness and non-discrimination is another principle that AI is concerned with. And the reason is because we've had the use of AI in, let's say, even in the US, in the prison system, court system, that have had unwanted and unfortunate results, or in terms of when AI-based technologies like facial recognition have been used by the police and how they've impacted and resulted in false arrests that have been very traumatizing experience for the person who was arrested. So a lot of it is based on the data set that the company had to begin with. They didn't care and they went on in creating their technology, and now that facial recognition app has these negative consequences. Human control of technology is another way, and that is the human, one aspect of it is human review of automated decision. So an example that we may be moving towards is in medical decision. If you are given a diagnosis based on a machine that has said you should be prescribed this prescription, you take the drug and it has a negative effect and you realize that it was the wrong decision, should you be able to ask for a human review of that decision so that you have human control over the machine rather than the direct following the direct order of the machine? Ability to opt out. So if you don't want to, let's say the bank analyzing your files by the AI system that they have, is that an option? Do we want that? Or is that too burdensome on the part of these banks and also the tech companies? And lastly, human values and the way that we want to think about human flourishing. And how does that come into play when we're designing products that are based on artificial intelligence? So this is where I get into some of the ways that may be different from the view of as an Islamic perspective view. Please be mindful that I summarize these principles that I said. There are a lot more, and I encourage you to read them, either the Berkman-Klein study or the UNESCO's recommendation. They go into much more details. So one of the principles that we talk about, for example, was privacy. So there are multiple examples that we can see how things can be different when we're designing an AI product that either has a privacy implication, or let's say it has algorithms that promote certain way of engagement, like on social media platforms, and maybe in a way to bring it home of how privacy can be different from one culture to the other. I recommend this James Whitman article, The Two Western Cultures of Privacy, Dignity versus Liberty. So it compares an American approach towards privacy to a European approach towards privacy, and goes through multiple examples to show how, although these two cultures may on the surface look similar, they have really deep differences within them. So some of the examples that it goes through is, let's say, nudity as we have it in Europe or in France, and versus nudity in the US. Or one example which might be debatable is how comfortable people are sharing their salaries. So saying that in France, if you ask someone, what is your salary? It is a very negative question, and it's breaching their privacy, versus in the US, it might not as much you might not have that much of a reaction, which again I'm not so sure about this. But again, it goes through these examples that you may see that even the US and the French that on the surface may look similar when you compare them to, for example, the US and Middle Eastern country, a Muslim majority country that would be on the surface very different. You see that these differences also exist in countries that may have a lot of more shared common grounds. So another example is when we're thinking about falsehood and speech. So this comes up a lot in the use of social media platforms and how we write those algorithms. What do we want the AI machine to prioritize? So in the US, you may know that falsehood is actually a protected speech. So it's not based on the US Supreme Court decision. The government hasn't demonstrated that false statements should constitute a new category of unprotected speech, meaning that they're still protected. And this is one way that has allowed a lot of social media companies to allow for different statements to be kept online versus when we're thinking about libel and defamation in Muslim majority countries that can be different. And as you know, for example, suing for defamation in the US is very difficult, not impossible, but with all the categories of public figure and public interest, it has made it very difficult for people to sue when they're being defamed, especially for famous people, versus other countries that may not share that idea of this broader unprotected category of, let's say, public figures and how they see things differently when we're talking about defamation and what it means to say the truth or not. So this is just an overview of so many countries that do have a Muslim majority population, and let's imagine, and we don't have to imagine, this is true, that they're actually using the same social media platforms that are based in the US and are created in the US with underlying values, although they're being very, taking a different approach these days, trying to combat some of these challenges that the use of social media platforms in other countries that don't necessarily share the same values have had catastrophic results. So I thought I'd just give some of the examples of how the Holy Book of Quran talks about reputation, telling the truth, and what it means if you ridicule another, and how it's been heavily emphasized that this is wrong and you should not do it. In Surah Al-Hujurat, it talks about not even conjecture, how this is a sin. It's like backbiting one another. It compares it with, the book compares it with eating the flesh of your brother. That's how much the Holy Book believes that it has negative impact in the whole community, even though if you think it's only one person that you're, let's say, talking behind their back. Another example is the way that the book encourages you to check the information, the source of information, that once you hear about it, don't be quick to draw into conclusion. It discourages you from interacting with people who are habitual swearer or always engaged in gossiping, which is seems to be the monetary value of a lot of social media posts. It's all about gossips. And another example, this is not from the Holy Book of Quran, this is the sayings of the great grandson of the Prophet, Imam Sajjad, that talks about the right of the tongue. So rather than you having the right, it offers a way of thinking about how even different body parts have the rights. So you should think about those rights that these body parts have, and the right of the tongue include not saying things that are obscene or not telling untruths. So if you do say those things, it's that you are in violation of your tongue's right, that when you engage in saying these false statements. So another hadith that I thought I'd share is encouraging telling the truth, even if it's against you. And this one, I didn't translate it in English, but it talks about how when there is a lot of answers, it makes you confused about what the truth is. And I thought it's a nice comparison with the idea of marketplace of ideas that is offered in the US, that talks about the more answers that you have, it will allow you to finally go to what is truth, because in this marketplace, those false speech will eventually lose value, and you will rely on what is the truth. But it has been questionable even by the US Supreme Court whether that holds truth, especially after what we've seen with the misinformation and disinformation campaigns that have happened on social media platforms, and how much difficult it has been to prove the truth once there is that widespread false online. So, of course, all religious books offer these kind of recommendations of being honest, being truthful. One way to set it apart is that these recommendations in the Holy Book of Quran have actually become law in a lot of countries. So there are many Muslim majority countries that have implemented these verses into their penal codes or civil codes that have consequences. So with an AI machine that, for example, you may have heard in the Facebook whistleblower, how Facebook prioritized engagement over truth. So even though knowing that based on the allegation that the Facebook whistleblower made, knowing that an information has been hurtful or is false, they allowed the information to continually be spread out because of the engagement that it could result, and it meant more money and profit for the company. So while at the program of Islamic law at Harvard Law School, I conducted a research with the help of my great RA that I want to say thanks to, Abtisam Saleh, who helped me do the survey. We did a survey based on the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, countries that are a member of this organization. This organization is the second largest after the UN, with currently having 57 states part of it. So we went through all these countries to see how many of these Muslim majority countries have AI guidelines that would incorporate some of their own values into their guidelines, rather than relying on a generic guideline that we may have. So the results were not so hopeful. 22 countries have no AI strategies, and they're not even thinking about it, and it has a lot of reasons, some of them because of monetary issues, some of them because of, again, economic crisis that they may have. They don't have enough resources to focus on this issue that seems like a luxury. But at the same time, we also have 24 countries that have explicit AI strategy, even if they don't have the guidelines or the laws. They've started, setting up committees, setting up talks for these issues and how they want to incorporate them. And some of the countries that didn't have any AI strategy, they were still trying to come up with some and trying to make them work either through collaboration with other countries or collaboration with companies. So some of the example has been Tunisia, that is participating and collaborating with Morocco, or we've had even countries that are using partnership with companies such as Microsoft, which is again a US-based company. But it just shows that even though many of them don't have the necessary resources or don't think of this as a priority, they are nevertheless engaging in the conversation. And in the publication that I hope to have from this talk, the list of these countries are also available. So to conclude the talk of why it matters to have, when we're thinking about values that are incorporated in AI machines, why does it matter to have those kind of cultural and religious traditions involved? Does it matter or not? So one, and how is it different? One example that I think it's a really good example to show how it is different from one region to the other, and how maybe a generic AI guidelines will not be so helpful, is this experiment that was published in the Nature magazine that basically asked the audience of, if you have a machine, who should it run? If you have, let's say, two pedestrians that are situated in the same sidewalk, and you have to choose to run over one to save the other, the answers were different. So some cultures actually prefer to save the elderly because they thought that they are more valuable. Some other cultures prefer to save the young or the toddler because they thought that they have a longer lifespan and as such may be more valuable. So I think this is a good example of cultural differences and that come into play and how we want to think about them. Another question that I want you to think about is one reason that we should be concerned about AI is when AI is making value judgments for us. And the example of autonomous vehicle is one AI-based technology that seems to be moving towards the technology where you have a complete autonomous vehicle, even though we're not there yet. But once we get there, it is a question of the famous trolley problem. Would you buy, in a modern format, if you would buy a machine, a brand new Tesla that will sacrifice you in order to save someone, or would you rather buy a machine that doesn't sacrifice the driver over a pedestrian that's running into the car? So these are some of the examples of value making. This is just a picture to show that it does cause accident, these AI machines, and this was an accident that happened when Tesla's autopilot was being tested. Another way of the design of these AIs was also a case which was recently came out. So Snapchat had this filter that allowed you to again, based on these machine learnings and AI technology, to detect the speed. And someone, I think a teenager, I'm not sure if it was what age was the person, tried to do this while driving and to take a screenshot of her speed, and resulted into having a very bad accident, and they tried to sue the Snapchat for allowing this filter to be used, even though they had given warning and they knew of the dangers that teens may have when they try to use this Snapchat. So again, it's trying to think about what kind of technologies do we want to have? Who are we prioritizing? Are we prioritizing money? Are we prioritizing humans? Do we want to have technologies that are not yet ready, but again, they seem to be making a lot of profit? Or should we think about human values that are at the heart of it? And I'll leave you with this picture that seems really sci-fi, but it's maybe the future that we are moving towards. This is an experience that I think Colombia, the country, was trying to advertise traveling there, and they did this augmented reality of allowing the room to be present at that time. And I should leave with a hopeful note that there are a lot of centers these days that are concerned with human-centric AI and are working on these values. And my recommendation for the Islamic world is that they should also become more involved and more engaged and try to implement their own cultural tradition, not necessarily only cultural, but religious traditions that they want to have, rather than be passive into taking what is coming to them. So one last conclusion. Michael Cook has a book on a brief history of human and he's a historian at Princeton University. He talks about when the Industrial Revolution happened in Great Britain. And he said that when the revolution happened, there were only some options for the other countries. There were three options. So they either had to follow the Industrial Revolution and become modern. They could either ignore it altogether, which he says was foolish. And there was the third way, which was proposing an alternative. And he says that the political Islam was the third alternative that tried to offer a new way of both being modern and still keeping some of the values. And whether they've been successful or not remains a question, but I think it opens up the opportunity to, now that we are having this digital revolution rather than maybe the industrial revolution, do we want to be, does the Islamic world want to be passive, or does it want to offer a new way of modernity? And with that, thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take question and answer.
I will hold the cue. I'm going to turn this chair around here.
So I'm just thinking here, thank you, wonderful and enlightening. Thank you for sharing those thoughts and bring more questions than answers, I guess. But you're saying these very much are guidelines and are not laws, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are we heading towards at one point where these would become laws, or you can't, because of the reasons you mentioned, there's different values and different cultures you can't impose. And I'm interested to know, where does Russia and China fit on those? I mean, is this a UN totally agreed guidelines, or is there more to it?
Yes, thank you so much. So there have been a lot of criticism towards AI guidelines because of what you're saying, how maybe they are ineffective. If you just have guidelines and there's no mandatory or there's no coercion for these companies or those who are involved to implement them, what is the result that you want to have, or does it have any impact to begin with? And I think even the passage of the UNESCO's recommendation, which I did not check to see whether China and Russia are signatories to this recommendation or whether they declined. So I'm sorry about that, but it was a very slow process, but it's still, they're very happy about it, and they think it provides a footprint or just a generic guideline that may be implemented for those countries who want to turn them into laws, albeit very narrowly. But again, with AI, even though it's difficult and because it's rapid, I think that we should use these principles more heavily into our legal analysis and try to advocate for them to turn into laws so that we can actually hold people responsible. But I have to say that one reason is just difficulty in, again, you see some of this happening in the privacy world, because scholars have been so much engaged with the literature that we are now at a point where, for example, California has passed laws, and Colorado, Virginia, New York, they're passing laws for privacy and consumer protection. And I don't think we're far away from days where we would see even more attention to AI, especially after the Facebook whistleblower incident that talked about algorithms being intentionally and with knowledge used against the community. Was there?
I have two questions.
Yes.
The first one, obviously, there is data in regards to AI where there is some bias in regards to color and race. Does that apply to religion as well?
Yeah, so it can be used. Maybe one good example that a study that talked about digital ethics in the Islamic nation did was companies that may be following taxis that have Muslim drivers and how they make stops, routine stops when it's the time of prayers. So that surveillance can allow for, you can imagine, targeted advertisement and maybe bias when you recognize which driver is a practicing Muslim that makes this stop for prayer, and maybe you have people who have Islamophobia and they don't want to get into a taxi with a Muslim. What if you have a company that uses that data to let you signal and opt out of riding with a Muslim? It may sound crazy, but I think there are people who would engage in this kind of technology and the use of religion as a bias.
Thank you. My second question, and this is pretty unique, it pertains to healthcare and medical devices.
Mm-hmm.
I represent a company where we use AI to have algorithms for predictive behavior and determining cardiovascular events, and to help interventional cardiologists determine whether they should intervene or not intervene. And I'm getting ready to take this technology to the Middle East. Are there any elements of AI in the healthcare industry or the medical industry that are applicable in the Middle Eastern countries that we should be aware of?
Yes, I think Riyadh has passed a document on specifically with respect to healthcare and digital use of healthcare technology. If you shoot me an email, I can send you the link. I don't have enough. Yes, yeah. So I think Riyadh has one.
Well,
I didn't have a question from online after.
that's fine. You can take it.
Oh, no, please first.
Well, I have a million questions.
Let's start with the first one.
So I'm a radiologist by profession, and I mean, and we're already seeing the implementation of AI in our world, even into the diagnosis.
Yes.
X-rays, CTs, MRIs. But Zahra, we're at just the nascent stages of AI right now. We aren't even there, and yet, you know, now we're talking about the metaverse.
Yeah.
And us consumed. And you showed slides where, you know, of course, people are wearing goggles, and now they're actually getting immersed into an experience, and that experience is learning from their body language about who they are, what they want. Are we potentially going to get lost in the digital world ourselves? And you know, it's not just an Islamic perspective now. We're talking about a human perspective on what's the effect of humanity. How are people like yourself or they're involved? What are you looking at to create laws for this? How do you come about it? When you don't know, we know so little about it.
Thank you so much. So first of all, I would say with talks like this that engage our law students and our scholars with the problem. So the first step is always knowing that there's a problem and then trying to solve the problem. So I think this is helpful, albeit very minimal, and you may think less impactful, but when you trigger those questions in the minds of students, they're the ones who are going to find hopefully the right answer for us. But as you said, with respect to AI technology, a lot of people are saying that AI is now no longer an emerging technology, it's a mature technology. But with the new forms of tech that are emerging and the new ways of deep fake, facial recognition, I mean, we can talk for hours about all of the legal challenges that they may have. I'm in the camp of advocating for laws, albeit minimal or maybe small in terms of their, you know, the length of the code that you may have, but I too think that it's not a good way to be passive in this and allow companies to just run try and error at the cost of human life, as we see with some of these accidents. Yeah, but you know, it always starts with posing the question, recognizing the challenge, and then trying to answer. Yes.
We'll just take the question from online, Marianne, and then you'll be after.
And I was just going to make a small suggestion to stop sharing your screen.
Oh,
you
sorry.
will be,
Yes.
more present to the online audience. The question is, can you share some insights on the moral and ethical implications on AI impact on the labor force? For example, there are robots being used to serve customers in a restaurant. Kiosks are being developed, which allows you to enter your choice for coffee, which is then prepared by a robot, all of which will replace human beings who are in need of such jobs to sustain their livelihood.
Yes, so I just bought a cupcake from a vending machine at the airport, and the interaction with the robot went very well. I have to say that I don't want to leave the audience with a negative thought towards AI technologies. We should also recognize the positive impact that they're having from medical schools using these technologies for recognizing different body parts to as some of the example that our audience have shared with respect to the labor force. But at the same time, we shouldn't be too drawing a rosy picture, because without those guidelines, for example, you've had cases where Amazon has been accused of using an AI-based technology that rejected candidates for employment. And you can see if we have, let's say, federal government using those technologies that have impact on people who are trying to get hired. So this can be a negative impact. And with a fair and open data set, that is one of the values that AI principles try to advocate for. We can hope for these technologies to have a more positive impact on the labor force, rather than the negative impact of, let's say, gender bias on an application or institutional bias on applications that you may have. And talk about Amazon and how it uses technology. It's in its warehouse. I encourage you to read about it. There are a lot of sad problems of how these technologies are being used in terms of monitoring the labor force and the negative impact. But again, they do also have positive, no doubt about it. So I'm going to entertain the audience with a joke that there's, maybe make it more Islamic tradition. There's this joke that says an imam in a mosque is talking about heaven the whole time. So the audience, one of the audience raises their hand and says, why are you only talking about heaven? Don't you want to scare us with hell? And the imam says, you're going to all go to hell and see it for yourself. So AI has positive implications. I'm only talking about the negative because we are so engaged with the positive that we may sometimes forget the negative implications that these AI may have.
I was just wondering, like, how many legal cases have come up in technology? Like, how far is it gotten? Like, how are they enforcing a lot of these ethical issues and stuff like that?
Yeah, so unfortunately, a lot of them are going into settlements, so we don't have so much precedent. One example, another example, in addition to the ones that I have given, is Facebook was sued, or Meta was sued for the facial recognition technology that it had in Illinois, and Illinois used to have a law that protected biometric information. When on Facebook, you were allowed to be tagged. So when you were tagged, the people sued that they didn't want to be tagged and recognized this way, and it appeared that the court was moving towards saying that Facebook is responsible here, when Facebook pulled out and came up with a settlement. So there are cases, but companies are really trying to get out of the litigation, not to set enforcement by going to settlements. And even FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, imposes a lot of penalties on them, but how much they've been impactful, it's questionable. All right.
Okay,
Thank you so
well,
much.
thank you so much. Let's have another.
Thank you.
So this concludes today's smallest lecture in Islamic legal studies, and we invite you to pick up a boxed lunch from the table that I think is set up outside in the hallway. And if you're fasting, feel welcome to take a box and you can enjoy it later. Thank you, Professor Takhshid. Thank you to all of you in attendance. And again, many thanks to Mohannad Malas for the generosity that has made this event and this lecture series possible. So have a good afternoon, everybody, and thank you again for joining us.